Wat kuf nuela du, Chris Nyongets, aqua honi wagita loda, okale, oniata aga, nawagad choda. So I said in my language, the Oneida language, I extend my greetings, love, and thankfulness to all of you. I am Chris Cornelius of the Wolf Clan and people of the Standing Stone is the earth that I come from. I want to thank Tina for the invitation to speak here to you and then to share the work. So how I'm going to kind of start the talk is really to give a kind of framework for how I see architecture for Indigenous people, and then how that applies to the work that I do, and I kind of frame it in through both lenses, meaning the sort of non-Indigenous lens, which is how I was educated in architecture, and then the Indigenous lens. So as architecture students, we early history courses, we look at the Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown book about learning from Las Vegas. And in the book, they talk about how the role of signage in architecture in particular. So sometimes the architecture is the sign, which is like the duck, or their signage is applied to the architecture, which is the decorated shed. So when I started my graduate study at the University of Virginia, and I did my thesis work, I really was looking at how architecture was being made for Native clients at the end of the 20th century. And for me, it kind of fell into two types of categories, the buildings that were being done. One was what I call the zoomorph, the buildings that look like animals. This is an elementary school. This is actually the elementary school on my reservation where I came from. I didn't attend that school. That school was built in the 90s, but it's a turtle. Everything about it is a turtle. The gym is in the head. It has eyes on the exterior of it, his feet and tail and everything else. But once you get inside it, you don't know that you're inside a turtle. It's just like any other sort of building that has our sort of radial layout. So there are a number of buildings like this. There are other turtles, there's bears, there's thunderbirds, there's other sorts of animals that occur across the U.S. and Canada. The second was what I call the pictograph, which is a building that is a normal sort of building, but native iconography is applied to it. That doesn't necessarily make it native. Applying that iconography, the patterns from traditional arts or other sorts of cultural sources doesn't necessarily make the building itself cultural. So I saw the association between these things, right, the duck and the decorated shed, because the ways that architecture was being done for Indigenous people was being done in this kind of manner. Still kind of is, but for me that was a critique. That was a critique of the thing that I didn't want to do. I thought there had to be some better way to do things for Indigenous people. So a second thought that I want to kind of share with you that helps frame the work is how Indigenous people see the landscape. And throughout North America, but what I'm really thinking about is the U.S. and Canada. There's very little cultural difference between the Indigenous people in the U.S. and Indigenous people in Canada. But this landscape in Utah is called Bears Ears. And so these are the languages. There's 4 different languages of the people that are indigenous to that area. I won't try to pronounce them. Those aren't my languages. But they all basically translate into Bears Ears. And this is a national park designated by President Obama. But when you look at the landscape, you can see the ears, right? This looks like a bear that's partially submerged and only the ears are kind of sticking out of the water kind of thing. So they had stories that go along with the landscape. So when you see the landscape, you associate it with these stories, and the stories are really important because they tell you things about the landscape and the things that occurred or may have occurred there. So it creates a larger mythology that ties people to the land. And so that is a thing that I'm trying to kind of culturally tie into. And so there are a number of things like this in the landscape. This is just one of the examples that I wanted to show. Because it's, for me and for Indigenous people really, it's beyond this pareidolia effect. Pareidolia is the term for like when you look at a cloud and you see a dog or a dragon or something like that, right? Like you see a thing in it. It's beyond that. It's beyond just seeing a thing. It's tying it into the landscape with the culture's mythology and their existence. And then, excuse me, the last thing I want to talk about too is that in architecture school we talk about the origins of architecture, and this is the frontispiece from Logier's retelling of architecture. And so in the image, the woman is, we're supposed to assume she's the architect that's created this structure, right? The structure is coming from nature, and the way that this is illustrated is how architecture is tied to nature, and it's seeing nature as a resource for architecture. I oppose this with the ways that indigenous people have seen architecture. Architecture and building has always been a part of our culture. It isn't something, however, that we've specifically talked about. Like many other parts of our culture, like religion, politics, agriculture, business, those kinds of things, all of those things were part of the culture in a seamless way in a series of reciprocities. So architecture was seen as an extension of nature. Building was an extension of the culture, and so how those things actually come together. So for me, the difference here is that on the right, we're seeing nature as a resource for us to take and to use to create architecture. So nature is mine. Nature is mine to take as a resource, that I can use that thing as a resource to kind of better our environment. And the other is nature is me. I'm related to nature. So in many indigenous cultures, this concept of all my relations, and that is a term that gets translated differently in different cultures, but it's basically saying and stating that we are related. All living things are related. I'm related to the earth, it is my mother. I'm related to the moon, it is my grandmother. I'm related to trees, I'm related to stones, I'm related to everything. And I believe that if we thought about architecture as if we were related to it, we would think about it differently, right? We would think about it in a very responsible manner. And that is true. And everything that we use in building buildings, we're related to it. So that's a big sort of concept for me and the way that I think about architecture and making architecture for indigenous people. So I'll start with the Indian Community School of Milwaukee. Is a K-4 through 8 private school in Milwaukee that serves indigenous students. There's about 320 indigenous students that attend the school, and they all come from metropolitan Milwaukee, so they're from an urban context. Very few of them have connections to their home reservations. So there are 11 tribes in Wisconsin. That's the primary student body, but students from all indigenous cultures come to the school. And so when I was asked to be a part of the design team with Antoine Predock, he took me to become part of the team, and I told him that the indigenous culture is not one that can be delaminated. You can't just like show things in a kind of cause and effect way, that it's actually a series of reciprocities. And so how we decided to do this, because we weren't making a project for a single tribe or a single culture, we had to look at cultural values. And we looked at multiple cultural values, and we created graphic translations of each of those values. So we ended up with about 30 of them. We brainstormed early on in the project. We had probably 80 of them, but we boiled it down to 30 essential ones. So this one is dance, and we created a graphic for that. And then this one is the moon. We created a graphic for that. It's about the cycles and reciprocity of the moon. And all of these are intended to overlay with one another. So when we presented them to the community, we printed them on 3-foot by 4-foot transparencies. We built a light box, and then we talked about each one, and we put it on the light box. And we started to show how all of these things were intertwined with one another, how they began to have a dialogue with each other. And so this is a graphic that I created of the building. And in that process, what it did was it changed the way that we talked about the program of the building. So early on in the project, we all decided that we were going to remove any sort of institutional names that went along with the thing. We were just trying to deinstitutionalize the school itself. So we never, ever called the place that they eat the cafeteria. The school's been open going on 11 years. Going on 12 years rather. No one has ever called it the cafeteria. We called it feast. We don't call the place that you enter the building the lobby. It's community. The theater is drum. The stair that connects the lower school grades to the middle school grades is called earth to sky. So all of those terms were part of my role in the project to sort of embed all of the cultural aspects in the architecture in the building itself. And so and then part of my role too was to name classrooms. So I named classrooms based on the things that they were adjacent to on the site. So on this northern edge here is close to a wetland. So those classrooms are animals that are in the wetland, turtles, muskrats, those kinds of things, because they show up in the culture in different ways. Some show up in creation stories, some show up in clan structures, but when students go to that classroom, they say they're going to Turtle. They don't say Miss So-and-so's room or 126. they say turtle, right? That's my classroom. Some of their classrooms are strawberry. Some of them are wolf. Some of them are the moon. Some of them are thunder. Like all of these, all of the classrooms have names that are associated with the culture. They teach, currently teach 3 languages, Oneida, Ojibwe, and Menominee. The Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi are the other, there's 5 sort of cultural groups that are indigenous to Wisconsin, or part of the indigenous people of Wisconsin. Those 2 cultures have decided they didn't want to teach their language in the school, so the students can learn those 3 languages if they choose. So this is the school. It's about 165,000 square feet. It's almost a quarter of a mile from the end where the gym is, and this lower end here. So most of the elementary school grades, the K through 5, are on the first floor, and then the 6th, 7th, and 8th, the middle school grades are on the second floor. We've always talked about the building as if it were an animal inhabiting the site. So we think about the architecture as if it were embedding itself into the site and nestling itself into this property. The school itself bought about 200 acres, and so they purchased most of the land that you see in the photo, so that no one can kind of develop that land. But when we laid out the footprint of it, we had our civil engineer come out, tape out the sort of footprint, and then we actually moved the building a little bit to get around some trees. We took out very few trees. I think we only took out 3 trees, 2 of which needed to be taken out because they were dying. And then this one we call the Wisdom Keeper. Here, there's a sort of land amphitheater that goes around it, and it's a kind of storytelling tree. So another thing that we gave a name to was the student entrance. So this is a big ritual every day. Students come into the school and leave the school. Big event every single day, and that's called migration. So this is the student entrance, how the students come into the building. The building itself is not only a school, but it's a center of community. People from the community come and use the school. Elders come and use the school. They use it for different community events and different sort of cultural events in the area. They've had conferences, Indigenous conferences, other conferences actually in the building. This is the second floor where the middle school grades are. You can see the tree columns. You'll see in this photo and the next one. The trees were harvested from the Menominee Nation of Wisconsin, which they are indigenous to most of the state of Wisconsin. And the trees are a really integral part of their culture. Their culture is really embedded in trees. If you look at a satellite photo of Wisconsin, you can see where the Menominee Nation is. It's a rectangle just northwest of Green Bay, if you know where that is. It looks like it's photoshopped because they have always sustainably harvested their trees. The trees there are so dense and so healthy, and that forest is so rich that they actually decided a few years ago to drop the Forest Stewardship Council as standard because their standards weren't high enough. Their standards weren't as high as they were for the culture. But these trees were taken down with a ceremony. They gave their lives to the school, so we think of them as holding stories. Many of them are over 300 years old, so they hold stories of pre-European contact, and those trees are within the building and throughout the building. They're white pines. So we're looking at community. This is community, and then drum is the theater. The natural light that comes into the building is really important to us, and the views of the site were really important to the clients. They wrote a design goal statement before we started on the project that talked about how they wanted those things to be important. The connection to nature. They wanted students to be able to see nature through classrooms and things like that. So this is another space. It's called the Place of Nations. It's really, the room itself is used in different ways. Classrooms can go in there, teachers can take students in to kind of counsel them. The entire school deals with discipline very differently than most schools. They deal with it through the role of responsibility, right? It's the student's responsibility to correct what they've wronged, and so it's a matter of really counseling students than it is about punishing students. And understanding that a lot of these students are coming from backgrounds that are not so great, right? Their family situations aren't great, so it's difficult for them to concentrate in school, and so they really try to integrate that into the curriculum. So these are pieces of furniture that I designed for this space, and I call it the Four Corners. So it's where in the U.S. where New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado kind of come together. That's a sacred spot for the people that are indigenous to that area. It's a spot actually where if you look, you can see 4 mountains and how they actually come together. So their creation story actually talks about them emerging from that spot. And so the pieces here are individual pieces. The 4 mountains, this is one, there's one over here, 3 and 4, and then these 2 pieces, this one's called Mesa and that one's called Mound. They all kind of nest, and they also offer different seating postures. You can sit on top of the high part. You can see there's a step there, so that if you sit and face the other way, there's other sorts of postures that you are in. So wherever in the school too, we really thought about that idea that there are students of different sizes, and the furniture, it reflects that. Even the window sizes reflect that. Some of the windows go to the floor, so only like little kids can actually kind of see out of the building. So we really kind of thought about that. So that was a project that really established my practice and really helped me explain and show how I was thinking about Indigenous design at that time. So I want to share with you 3 larger concepts that kind of frame the work. The first is the idea or notion that design is ceremony. To me, it's ceremonial. The design aspect of what I do is kind of ritualistic in a way. Like I need to be of a good mind to put things into the world, right? If I'm making physical spaces for people, whether they're Indigenous or not, it doesn't really matter to me. As a designer, I think about it as a ceremony. So the ritual of creating the thing, how I'm creating it, thinking about the responsibilities I have as a designer and how it's made and how it will last or how it will weather are all those kinds of things that I think about. So the Indian Community School is the greatest client I've ever had, to be honest, because they understood everything that I was talking about, and they're still a client of mine. So I started my relationship with them 16 and a half years ago, and I still work for them. So occasionally other projects will come up. This is one of the smaller projects that I did for them. I created a room for changing for their sweat lodge ceremony. So it's basically a space that you just go into to change out of your street clothes into the clothes that you go into the sweat lodge ceremony and then back out when you come out of that ceremony. Because people were just like kind of changing in the school or in their car or something like that. So this is on the campus, and I call it Grandfather Stone. The stone itself is actually part of the ceremony because it's the stones that retain the heat for the fire that creates the ritual of the sweat lodge. I wanted to make something that looked geological, that looked like something that was already on the site, and so I was inspired by these large stones that were excavated during the process of building the school. So this one in particular, the faceted sort of form of it is what inspires the form of that. And I began to think about this idea or notion that if you took a stone and rolled it around on the ground, you could make the surface of the thing continuous, right? The surface of the entire stone is continuous. So that's the thing that sort of guided the forms that I was making. If I made them out of paper, that had to be one piece of paper. Like it couldn't be multiple pieces of paper. And so that is the model of that. I actually gave the model to the carpenters that framed the piece, and they kind of put it together to understand how the geometry of the thing worked. And then there's a sort of sketch that I did on the project early on. So the drawing part of what I do is important, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Another project that I did, this was a completely self-initiated project when I didn't have a lot of commission work. I began to think about what if we had architecture where we weren't quite sure who the architects were or the builders. Are they human? Are they animals? Are they some other sort of phenomena that we don't really kind of know about? But whatever they are, they have this sort of tacit understanding of nature. And so I made these kind of temporary dwellings out of usually metals, brass, bronze, copper mesh, brass mesh, all kind of soldered together. So part of it was I was exploring these kinds of materials and making models. The other was, what if I started to design completely in a model, meaning like these are three-dimensional sketches, so I don't have, for some of them I don't have drawings that lead to the model. In architecture, we're always kind of like, the drawings we do, the models we make are always representing the thing, right? Like if this is the designed object and if it's a building, we always think about the building and then we represent that, right? I was more interested in what if the actual thing itself came out of the process of making the representation of it through the drawings or models. And so I built these plaster landscapes for each of these, and I kind of gave each one a little bit of a sort of role. This one is called the Moonscope. It's about viewing the moon. It's built into this old sewing machine base. So I was finding these old boxes, and the old boxes were what I was using for the site. Right, the sites are always given to us, so we can't really change the constraints of that. Right, we can't make it bigger, we can't make it smaller. It is the condition that we are given as designers. The other thing you'll notice too is that I don't use scale figure people in these. I'm only using animals, and so we're not quite sure. Again, I wanted it to be unclear. I wanted that to be unclear or ambiguous, whether the people who are inhabiting these things and using them, building them, or if it was animals. Some of them did have drawings, so these are the drawings that led to these other pieces. This particular piece will look familiar in a few minutes, but this work, which I was doing around 2009 to 2012, I made probably 10 to 12 of these sort of models. They all were explorations of this whole idea, right? I was just kind of giving myself an assignment and a project to kind of do these things. So they started to get embedded in my mind, I guess, as a designer, like how I was going to start to think about using them afterwards once I did have commissioned work. A project that I did last year, 2018, summer of 2018, it was part of a residency in Wisconsin. In Sheboygan, Wisconsin, there's this literature garden for children that's just north of Milwaukee, where I'm from. I received the residency there, and what I did was I wanted to communicate the role of the trickster in native storytelling. The trickster is something that uses, it tells us about our own sort of human weaknesses, our greed, vanity, those kinds of things are part of the trickster. And it might be an animal. For most tribes, it's an animal, and some others it's some sort of phenomena. This particular piece won the Architects Newspaper Award for Best Temporary installation for that year. And this is the trickster. So it doesn't have program or form. It subverts those sort of ideas. So it's not a pavilion. It's not a thing. I didn't name it a thing. It's kind of subscribe how you should use it. What I wanted children to do is to kind of figure out what it was, where it came from. So there's one really great story of one of the young people that was visiting and saw the thing, and they were like, is this an animal? I don't know if an animal made this or people made this, or is it part of a movie that I don't know what it's about? Like that was really how I wanted children to kind of think about the thing. So for me, when I built the thing too, I was thinking about, I didn't have a drawing, a model again. These things weren't part of how I was building the thing. It's made out of trees that were harvested on site. So I cut the trees down. It's clad primarily in copper mesh, and so it is loosely inspired by this model, which I call Bear. So the copper mesh that's on this model is the exact copper mesh that's on the full-scale thing. And then the process through which I go through to patina it, to color it, is all part of that. And you'll notice on each of these models too, the things that are kind of sticking out. I wasn't quite sure, like when I design these things too, like as an architect, I don't think I always have to be like 100% sure of what everything is in it. I was wondering, like, what if the thing could communicate with other things? I don't know if it needs to receive signals from something, or it could begin to be connected in a larger network that I'm not quite sure of. The other thing is that what I'm trying to do with this is I call those pieces its regalia. And so I'm looking at indigenous regalia and the use of that on indigenous wear, right? So those things, the regalia itself is like hyper ornament. It's more than just ornamental or aesthetic. It has meanings that have multiple meanings. It might be a trophy. It might be something that you were awarded in some way, but it also might have some connection to animals and other sorts of things. And so I think that architecture can have regalia. I think that architecture can actually have that kind of connection, this sort of hyper connection in how it works. And so this trickster has a regalia on the ends of it, this piece, and then the top pieces, you'll notice that it has its regalia. So this is, on the right is a photo of what I call in a sketch phase when the frame was sort of erected, and this is how I put the thing up basically by one person. Using this sort of indigenous technology of how teepees are actually made. They're made so that one person can actually erect the entire thing. And so by loosely tying together 3 trees, you can basically sort of lift this thing. And then once I had it up, I sort of walked it into its position and then started to attach these other pieces to it. So Spirit of Space, they make films for Stephen Hall, Jeannie Gang, a bunch of sort of world famous architects, and they happen to be friends of mine, and they made this film. And I didn't tell them how to make the film. They just basically said, Chris, we were going to go film this thing in the snow, and I said, awesome. What I really love about the film is they got the sense of what the Trickster is. If you notice in the film, they film it from a distance, almost as if it were an animal that you got too close to, you would scare it. And so they actually revealed things to me about the piece that I hadn't thought about before. So this summer, 2019, I actually had the opportunity to build a second one. I won the Knoll Fellowship for Established Artists, which is a fellowship for artists in the Milwaukee area. And part of that fellowship is a group exhibition at the Haggerty Museum at Marquette University in Milwaukee. And so part of that was, for me, what I decided was I was going to build another Trickster in a similar sort of manner, but I was going to build it in this indoor context. So what happens is the Trickster, for me, becomes a thing or a vehicle character to speak through. As a designer, I can speak through the thing. And so sometimes it's hard for, I think, me to explain completely and or understand, but I will tell you that in the process of making the thing, it starts to tell me what it wants to be. So these trees were harvested from the Linden Sculpture Garden north of Milwaukee. So they are about 35 feet tall. So the first day when I come into the install, these trees are laying on the ground, and I have to figure out, I have to get them back up the same way I built the previous one. And I will say that they're very small in diameter. They're only like 2.5, 3 inches in diameter, but they're super strong and they're super straight. So when you start pushing these things up, gravity starts to take over, and they'll go right over if you don't hang on to them. So in that way, for me, the thing starts to tell me what shape it wants to be and then how these things kind of go together. And so the process is basically the same as the previous Trickster, clad in this copper mesh that was patinaed before I got on site. And then I did this site, I call it a site drawing for the thing on the floor to kind of ground the thing. We're not quite sure, again, whether this thing is alien, where it came from. And then the regalia, because this was indoor, I could do a little bit more with the regalia. So there's fur on it. There are these antlers. We're not quite sure whether the antlers, again, are a trophy or the Trickster just found these things and put them on. The regalia on this one is a little bit more elaborate. And it is sort of loosely based on the model here. So on the model, it might be a little bit hard to see in the projection, but there's this wire that goes around the top. For me, that serves 2 purposes. The one primary purpose was I didn't like how the metal was coming to an end, so it kind of is a thing that goes around it to help end that as a design sort of feature. The other is, again, this idea or notion that what if it's sort of an antennae that this thing can receive signals. So for me, it was how can I translate the thing in a model that's about the size of this object to a full-scale thing. And so this Trickster has that on it. It has all of that as part of making the thing. So here's me attaching the copper mesh to the frame. And when I'm doing this, I really have to think about how I seam it. I don't want to call too much attention to how it's fastened to the frame, how the pieces actually interact with one another. So for me, it's almost like I'm making a shirt for a giant bear. Like I have to like fold it and seam it in very specific ways and then attach it. It kind of tells me what it wants to be. And then the Trickster, this is a tag that's on the top of it it says you're on indigenous land. In this case, the Trickster was speaking through me in a way that was thinking about how the role of the Trickster is to remind you of such things, right? The Trickster is on stolen land. The Trickster is very happy to be in this museum. It loves the idea of having won this award and getting the attention that it got. And so that was installed from June to August of this previous year. So, as mentioned, I won the inaugural Miller Prize as one of 5 Miller Prize winners in 2017, so for Exhibit Columbus in Columbus, Indiana. And then at that time, they ran it a little bit different than this previous one. It was a competition, and so there were 5 sites, there were 10 designers, so we're basically in a head-to-head competition on each of the sites, and then the sites were assigned to us. So the site that I got was First Christian Church by Eliel Saarinen. And Eero Saarinen, his son, built in 1942, the first modernist church, basically the first modernist church in the U.S., and one of the first modernist buildings in Columbus that sort of started the whole architecture program. But through that competition, what I wanted to do was bring awareness to the people that were indigenous to that land. Like, who was there first, really? And it's the Miami or the Miamia. And their primary structure, the thing that they dwelled in and built was the wigwam, which is true of most Great Lakes sort of region nations. But the Miami specifically was the thing that I sort of looked at, and how these structures were created out of these frames of trees that were bent over and create this dome, and then clad with bark or reed mats. In researching these things, I began to realize like how sort of really sophisticated they are technologically. So they're put into the ground in a way that resists the tension of the bending. They had to have a fire within it, right, so that the thing wouldn't fill up with smoke. They understood that they had to have a smoke hole and another sort of source of ventilation to get air into the thing. And so we did some research on the wigwams. And then on the right is traditional art of ribbon cutting that's done by the Miami people. It's usually a sort of really intricate pattern of grids that are overlaid with one another, so they cut these ribbons and then sew them back together. And I explained that the ways that we should see indigenous traditional art is really a reflection of nature, and it's not always a one-to-one thing. It doesn't equal one thing, right? So one of the things it might be looking at is like the feathers of an eagle, right? The feathers of an eagle are very different. They're shaped in a similar way. The feathers on the tail are different than the ones on the head, right? They have different purposes, and so that was a thing that I sort of responded to as well. And so on the site, if you know the site in Columbus, Indiana, the church actually occupies an entire city block, and so we were given this area to place the installation, and I decided to put it on that corner, aligning it with a larger geometry, which is actually a golden section geometry that Saarinen used through the entire thing. So when you look at the front of the church, everyone says, why is the cross not in the center of the thing? That's why it's not in the center, is because it's actually in the middle of the sanctuary, and then there's a side aisle on this side, but it aligns with the geometry that he used, and so where I placed it on the site was part of that geometry.
Wikiami is sited on First Christian Church, a National Historic Landmark designed by Eero Saarinen and Eliel Saarinen, his father. It's really a significant piece here in Columbus, and so I'm very happy to have Wikiami on the site at First Christian Church. Wikiami is the Miamia word for wigwam, which was a traditional dwelling of the Miami people. So I wanted to address the indigenous people of Indiana, particularly this area. And I wanted to make a structure that addressed how Native people see the world, see nature, see building. So what I tried to do is to look at the original wigwam structure. What are the constituent parts of that? Why did they use those pieces? So it was originally a round sort of structure that they used wood saplings that they put into the ground and then bent over to create a dome sort of shape and then clad it with mats or bark. So what I tried to do is to look at how those original structures were made and then to do that in a contemporary way using modern materials. The structure is steel rebar that is welded together, and then the outside is an expanded steel skin to allow some transparency. Sometimes it looks very veil-like. You can see right through it, and then different parts of the day when light is on it, looks a little bit more opaque. I did read some of Eliel Saarinen's writing, and he talks about nature and how architecture can be sympathetic to nature. The trees here make a very dense canopy. With the exception of this one corner, there's a kind of cavity within that canopy, and so that's kind of why the piece actually leans forward a bit. It kind of leans over the walk and to tuck it into the trees and to not really disturb any of the site. We built a wood form on scaffolding that was CNC cut, and then we had a company in Indianapolis bend the rebar in the elliptical shapes for the horizontals, and those were welded together. And I had a great crew of guys from Forcia, which is a local company here, that volunteered their time. They're excellent craftsmen, excellent workers, so they helped develop a system for putting these rings on, welding the verticals together, and to help put the panels on. So you know, people made this, even though the panels are water jet cut and we parametrically figured them out. Human hands made this thing. That to me, there was a correspondence to how people make buildings and how people are still making buildings today.
So the piece was there for about 2 years. We installed it in August of 2017, and it was deinstalled at the end of July this year, 2019. And it is, what I'm trying to do is to bring awareness to the indigenous people, so that not really replicating the form of the wigwam, right? It wasn't important to me to replicate that form. It was to sort of bring it into the 21st century, to think about the constituent parts of it, the frame and the cladding, the expanded steel cladding. I call its feathers, was bare steel, and so it rusted over that 2 years. And the way that it was situated, the top of it is angled to create this sort of solar event that happens on the fall equinox, which would be a time that it was in place. And so it lets in the maximum amount of light on that particular day. So the sun comes through the top and the door. And then in Columbus, they had like a library, storytelling area, time with kids in the thing. So the thing's been used for different purposes. I didn't really prescribe what it was used for or how it would be used. But I was really kind of compelled by this idea, or the image on the left from Nabokov and Easton's book about Native American architecture, how things were tied together, and then we're still tying rebar together, right? And when we make buildings today, steel rebar is tied by hand together. So that was part of why I used the rebar in the structure itself. And you see at the top here, it also has a regalia, so the orange pieces are part of its regalia. Didn't really sort of trim off the rebar, kind of let that extend the way that it wanted to extend. And I love this image that the photographer took of the two pieces together. For me, it's the piece and Saarinen having a conversation that we don't really understand. They're speaking an architectural language we may not be fully privy to, but for me it's a sort of meditative way of thinking about how you exist with this historic building. And then on the left was the spring of 2019, so that was at the sort of peak of when it sort of patinaed. That's the color that I kind of wanted it to come to. And then on the right was during the winter. And the thing I love about the image on the right is if you look at the piece and then you look at the trees, it's taking snow in the same way, right? Like it only has snow on one side, its sort of skin is still being revealed. And so I have always thought about the piece as an animal that inhabits the site again. It slept at night. There wasn't any lighting that went with the piece. It was kind of always open 24/7. So I was very happy to have that piece in Columbus for 2 years and really helped build a lasting relationship with Columbus, Indiana. I really love that place and I'm really fortunate to be a part of the Exhibit Columbus experience. So the second theme of my work that I want to talk about is drawing is medicine. So in Native culture, we talk about things as medicine, meaning it makes me feel better, it's putting good things into the world. So usually it's not just like using herbology for medicine, it's like using your activities and rituals for medicine as well. And so drawing for me is that. And so the things that I draw sometimes are speculations on ideas. For me, drawing is really an important part of what I do. I feel like the way that I create ideas is through drawing. I might not always know what the first thing is when I start to draw, but ideas do come out if I am drawing. So if I am working, those things do come out. So some of these drawings resulted in some of the models you've seen, other projects. Some of them are like for construction and commissioned work, so there's a mix of details and other sorts of things within them, but they've always been a part of what I do. And I also, when I travel, I sketch a lot. And so it's how I see the world, and it's how I get the world to be a part of where I am or who I am. So that idea of drawing came to play into this other project that I kind of gave myself was I wanted to make architecture based on my tribe's moon calendars, but not to make the architecture sort of metaphors for the moons. And so our calendar has different moons, and so usually those moons are named by things that we're doing, planting corn or making maple syrup or hunting or harvesting and storing. Those kinds of things are all part of what we do. And so I created the series of drawings. Each one of them takes the wind data of that particular month and translates it into different forms that are used for different things. And so this is a sort of canopy on the top of it. And again, as I draw these things, I'm really kind of speculating on who might be using this thing. I decided to make them all the same, take up the same volume, be displaced from the ground the same amount, have these antennae on the tops of them, and have some sort of canopy and have some sort of way or not to get into them. That way might be easy or difficult. In this case, I put this kind of ladder, really tall ladder on it. And again, I'm using animals as scale figures, but I'm trying to tie into these other aspects of indigenous architecture throughout the U.S., not just from my tribe, that this connection to earth and to sky and beginning to pull those things into it. So each of these, this particular drawing won the K-Rob Prize for Best Physical Submission, so for hand drawing. I draw these in layers, so it's this kind of ritualistic way of drawing them. I splash watercolors on them. They're not so like completely precious to me in that way, but I'm trying to generate ideas. I might write little notes on it. This one I said I roll out my cloud to make it rain, so the bear is pulling the cloud out, which is a sort of cistern that gathers water. This one is a thunder moon, so if the thunder happened at night, I need an apparatus to hear that. That's the top of it. Maybe think of a deer's ear, and so I put the deer in the drawing. So for me, when I think of things, I put them in the drawing, right? I try not to censor those things too much. I think that as designers, we can begin to censor or parse these things in different ways before we decide what is usable and what is not. And I think we're missing parts of our sort of cognitive system if we do that too much. This particular image for the Thunder Moon won the best digital image. I think in the sort of 50-plus history of the K-Rob, I might be the only person that's won both hand and digital. awards in that competition. So in drawing that, I will say, in drawing that, it also changed the way that I digitally render these things. I wanted these things to use other tools of rendering, not just like always hitting render and save, but to add other things, aspects to these. And then I started to write stories, short sort of stories about each one of these. In this one, I made my entrance like a cloud, so the bear doesn't know whether I'm coming or going. I created this sort of maze so he can't get in, and so we basically every day come to a draw in looking at these things. And so I'm also thinking about things like Chaco Canyon, which is masonry structures that rival what the Romans were doing. And there's no way they could have seen, known, heard, had any contact with the Romans or understood what they were doing. This is in New Mexico. And so the ways that they're making masonry openings, they figured out how to make a lintel, how to span things, how to create openings that aligned with the sun and the moon. And so when you see the sort of apertures that are made in these, I'm thinking about structures like this. So the last thing I'll talk about is decolonizing. And what does that actually mean? So for me, as an activity, design can begin to do that. And if we think about what colonization is, it's a system or an apparatus. And that system needs to be dismantled. We can't just critique it, protest against it. It has to be dismantled. And so we have to understand the system itself. And so the vocabulary of colonialism, and I borrow this from Linda Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies. She talks about it in these three sorts of things, and I see all three of them as architectural acts. She talks about the first thing is the line. It's usually a map or a survey. So when we find this territory, we're going to survey it so that we can take it, right? So that's what happened in the U.S. The U.S. was surveyed, laid out into states. When Jefferson did the Louisiana purchased a good portion of the U.S., the first thing they did was survey it, send Lewis and Clark out to kind of do that. So they establishing the territory. The second thing is to establish the center or the orientation of power. So we're going to put the church in the middle. We're going to put the city hall in the middle. We're going to put the seat of power in the middle of that thing. We're always establishing the center. And the third thing is the outside. The people are in opposition relation to each other. I'm here, you're there, we're in, you're out. That is all part, and all of that language and rhetoric is all about colonization. And so if we understand this system, this is how we can begin to design the way that we decolonize it. So what I'm trying to do is dismantle this sort of terminology so that we can begin to think about that. So the image here is the United States. Might be a little tough to see, but it's a triangulation of all of the federally recognized reservations in the U.S., and then the top 50 by population here are highlighted. And if you think about this map of the U.S., where people are, some of them are indigenous to this area, but most are pushed to that area. It's in this terra nullius or no man's land. It's hard to farm, it's low irrigation, right? It rarely rains, it's mountainous, it's really difficult to kind of live within. And so this project was a speculation on the idea that what I looked at was this American Indian occupation of Alcatraz Island, which happened from November of '69. The 50th anniversary is actually tomorrow. November 20, 1969 is when it started. And it lasted until June of 1971. So several hundred American Indian, mostly students and other sort of activist groups, occupied the island after it was decommissioned as a prison. The U.S. government put the land into surplus, and they basically occupied or took the island based on a treaty that the U.S. government made with the Lakota people in 1870, the Treaty of Fort Laramie. In that treaty, the U.S. government says any land we deem surplus you can have, and so that's why they took it. And when they took it, they didn't take it for political or financial gain. What they wanted to do was to make it into a native university, native cultural center, native ecological center. And so I wrote this grant proposal that examined the occupation because it was interesting to me that they wanted to take it and make architecture. Really, that was what they wanted to do. And so in the proposal, I proposed that they got what they wanted. And this is my supposition, the last thing that President Obama did in office was to give the southern end of Alcatraz Island, which is now a national park, to create a native university for 1,491 students. And so that's what this project is.
We are the tribe that they cannot see.
tribe called Red. They're an indigenous group that take EDM music and mix it with traditional singing and dancing. They're based in Canada, and the person's voice you hear is John Trudell, who is a native poet, activist. He was actually on the island of Alcatraz, was part of the occupation, and one of the last things he did before he passed away was this particular piece. And so the notion here is that you can begin to see what I'm trying to do is to tie into all of the complexities of why they would occupy the island and why they would want to turn it into this thing. And because that, as a very complex thing, it warranted this kind of drawing for me that was sort of multi-layered and valent in a way to look at different things. And so I created a series of drawings that are themed. This one is about trajectories. And so one of the first things I do is to draw every edge of every building on it, and then to what are all of the kinds of trajectories that I can begin to think of that are the air traffic, the water traffic through the San Francisco Bay, around the island, the winds, sun patterns, those kinds of things, but also these notions of other trajectories like what I would call the trajectory of death, which is the Trail of Tears. So if you can imagine a map of the U.S. where the Florida and the Carolinas, Georgia, and Oklahoma are, these people were literally walked from their homelands to Oklahoma in the 1800s. Many people died in that process, but it was a way to kind of take the land that they were indigenous to and put them into this one area, which wasn't a state yet, which was Oklahoma. So that's within the drawing. This one is called territories, and so I'm thinking about how different territories are claimed and identified. And one of the ways that is done on the island is through graffiti. You saw the Custer Had It Coming. That's actually a photo of graffiti that's on the island. So if we think about other sources of activism, rhetoric is important. Like what things are called and what sort of terms that people are using are important to that. And so the graffiti, I use petroglyphs, other sorts of maps of settlements, and so I'm proposing that the southern end of the island is where the sort of campus would go. This is an outline of Taos Pueblo, so almost the size of a city could go on a small city could go on that sort of piece of land. Underneath that is this idea of land secession, and secession is a fancy word for stolen. But the idea is that, and I use the South Dakota and I use Wisconsin as the two examples. One, because this was a huge territory. It was called the Great Sioux Territory, which is this outer line, and then the government came in and said you can't have all of that, you can only have this, and then you can only have this, and then the yellow lines are the federal reservation boundaries. This is the Standing Rock Reservation. This is where the pipeline goes through. And then Wisconsin, where I'm from, my tribe is indigenous to New York State, but we moved to Wisconsin in the 1820s, and when we moved, we purchased the land with the Menominee people. So when we moved here, we purchased this much of the state. So more than 20 years before it became a state, we purchased that. The federal government shrunk that to this and said you can only have that. So we purchased that, and then in 1838, the federal reservation boundary was established, and then we purchased that. So we are on land that we purchased 3 times, but we don't own all of it. We don't own all of it because of the Dawes Allotment Act that happened in the 1890s, which allotted every tribal member 40 acres, but didn't tell them that they had to pay taxes on it. And so when the tax bill came due, they would repossess the land. So that was a structural mechanism used to take the land back, basically. And so it got down to a point where we only owned about 20% of the land. I think we're somewhere in the 30 to 40% of land ownership within the reservation boundary today. But in this drawing, there are multiple things. Acoma Pueblo, which is a Pueblo city, and so I think that we need to change the canon of architecture. How we're teaching architecture and architectural history should be changed, because there is architecture that is indigenous to the U.S., right? The first masonry buildings were indigenous buildings. The first multi-story buildings were indigenous buildings. They were pueblos. The first sort of infrastructural systems of plumbing and sewage were indigenous systems. We don't teach that in history. So the Acoma is a pueblo that is one of the first cities in the U.S. It was settled in a sort of dense way in a similar manner to most of our cities. Chaco Canyon is a part of that as well. Again, I talked about how complex of a masonry structure it is. Also the fact that I want to point out that they figured out how to make masonry in circles, right? That wasn't a thing that people were doing at that time. And the people that made it were the Anasazi. And the Anasazi are a culture that completely disappeared. Actually, no one really knows what happened to them. There's no documentation, no history of it. Most people think that they moved away from their dwelling because of a drought and then sort of blended in with the Diné or a Navajo people of the Southwest. But it's really an interesting story because we don't really know all of the aspects of the culture and what happened to it. Like I said, I'm indexing petroglyphs. There's a group that goes around and 3D scans the petroglyphs to kind of preserve them, and so that those images are in the drawing itself. Also, I'm indexing through just text here, 12/29/1890. This is the date of the Wounded Knee Massacre. So in South Dakota, this is, so when I hear things like Las Vegas was the largest gun violence in the U.S., that's not actually true. Over 300 people were massacred at Wounded Knee. And they were massacred by the U.S. government, the U.S. Army. They were unarmed, they were dancing, and because they were dancing, their leader told them to keep dancing. The bullets won't hurt you if they start shooting, and they shot them. The people that they shot, of those 300 people, more than 200 were women and children. All of the men were actually out in the field fighting the U.S. cavalry. This is an image of that day. So this is the end of December in South Dakota. The ground is frozen, and the people were piled into this mass grave. This is the U.S. Army right here. This is our relationship with the U.S. government. The U.S. government is responsible for the largest acts of gun violence in this country against its own people. Now, this is only one incident. There are hundreds of these incidents. If you think about the fact, 1491, Indigenous people were 100% of the population of this continent. Now we're like less than 1%. We're barely 1%. So that system of genocide is really what it is, and it needs to be called that. Our government in the U.S. has not used that term. Canadians have only started to use that term. But I think in reality, in order for us to have a true dialogue about this, we have to be truthful about it and what happened. I don't think me or any other Indigenous person is screaming about this sort of thing and saying, well, we have to go back to the way that things were. No, we want recognition for this, right? We want, what are the other sorts of ways that we could begin to have this dialogue of having any kind of reconciliation with that in our history? We need this to be taught in our history books. Like, this is actually U.S. history, and it needs to be taught in what we're doing. So it's important to me that I index it through this text and not show that image. The only time I ever show the image is when I lecture about it, because it's very powerful. And I will say this too about that specific image. One of the biggest problems with the Dakota Access Pipeline is not just because it sacrifices the water quality of the area. It's because they had an archaeological survey history that was given to them that said people are buried in the ground. Human beings are buried in the ground. This land is sacred because our ancestors are buried within it. And I'm not like talking ancient ancestors. We're talking about grandparents, like 2 generations. I'm 2 generations from that. My grandmother was taken from her parents, put into a school, and forced to speak English. She didn't speak English until she was 13. I have to live with the trauma of that. I have to live with the trauma of why my grandmother would never teach me my language because of that, right? So this is not like ancient history. This is my grandmother. This is 2 generations from me. We have to be clear about these kinds of things. And that's what I'm trying to do with the drawing, is by indexing it through the text. So the project is ongoing. It's a research project. I'm also interested in how can we make data into form? How can I use it as a designer? And that's really, I do that through form. And so those 50 reservations, this is the population of it. Those are the area, and then that's the density, the sort of function of both of those people per acre. And I see those things as solid forms, like the thing is an actual thing. I won't get into all the complexities of this, but I started to create these data animals. I call them data animals because they're like shadow puppets, meaning like we're not so focused on what the hands are doing, we're more focused on what they sort of cast. Like, what do they start to become? And so the animals started to cast these interesting shadows. I'm also trying to tie into other indigenous things like the Zuni Pueblo. The Zuni people have these things called fetishes, which are really sort of small animals you can hold in your hand. They have a special meaning to them, and so I make these pieces. They're 3D printed and painted, and so this is in an exhibition I had at the University of Arkansas in January. You can see them on the right, and so I see them as animals. We're not quite sure. I'm not sure, and I'm not trying to make specific assertions about them being birds or other sorts of animals. Some are black, some are white, just like some things are male, some things are female, some things are predators, some things are prey. That's kind of where they kind of come from. And so the project itself is in this stage where I'm doing these massing studies, and like I said, the university will exist on the southern end of the island, which is mostly not used during the national park part of it, and so I'm making the assumption that it would still be a national park, people would go visit it, but it would have this university for Native students on it. So what I'm trying to do is to take all of this sort of information and then put it into something positive through the design, right? For me, the design, this idea of the design is ceremony, the drawing is medicine, and this decolonization are all tied together in a way that I will eventually sort of put into this specific project, and the hopes is that I would publish this as a sort of treatise on how I think about Indigenous architecture and tying into these other sort of aspects of the project and of the culture and how it exists in the world today. Yabako, thank you.